Hello, and a very warm welcome to the latest in our series of programs produced with XpertRule software on the way that manufacturers can and perhaps should respond to the challenge of net zero. Today we're looking at SMEs, which, given their overwhelming numbers in terms of the sector, are the most critical when it comes to UK manufacturing making progress towards a decarbonised future. Joining us today are Roger Singleton of Riscon Solutions and Roger Halliwell of Op-Tec Systems, both of which work with SME manufacturers to improve efficiencies in everything from design to process and automation. And of course, we're joined by Iain Crosley from XpertRule Software. Roger Singleton, perhaps I could start with you. When SME manufacturers ponder the challenge of net zero, what's likely to get in their way most?
What do I think is tricky for SMEs? I think there are a few things. The early ones that kind of always seem to spring up is what does net zero actually mean? And that's a complicated one sometimes to answer for them because even the definitions worldwide are a little woolly on them. There is a definition, but there's kind of room to maneuver on it about how much you should work around reducing your emissions versus offsetting them, and that's always a bit of a constant debate. So I think that's one area they struggle with a little bit. And then I think the other areas that they struggle with, and there are two that spring to mind, and it generally comes about from a conversation about the different areas, different scopes and categories that they'd actually have to reduce emissions around to actually achieve what would be known as net zero.
Can you just explain what Riscon does for them and how you've got such intense and deep knowledge of how it's impacting their policy making as they go forward?
One of the big management methodologies that we try and promote as a core capability of ourselves is managing change in kind of complex technical environments where there's a lot of different moving parts going on. And then we drop down to different layers and look at capabilities that have to be developed and then projects that are run to develop capabilities from that. So it's kind of a sort of top-down approach way of looking at it. But the one element that I think works well for people we engage with is they do see benefit of seeing the entire map of the journey that they have to do, even if there's details still missing of that map underneath. They broadly know the big areas of how their organisation would have to change moving forward. And what they tend to find is, like I said, it covers not just buildings and things. You move into purchasing, product design, process monitoring, as the guys joining us on this panel know well about. So there are lots of different sections that organisations are going to have to look at in order to actually achieve net zero.
Roger Halliwell, Op-Tec, experts in process control and automation. What have you discovered in your contacts with SME manufacturers about their readiness for net zero, and what are the obstacles that have come up for you?
Essentially, Nick, we have issues with the SMEs in terms of really their basic infrastructure, and when I say their basic infrastructure, there's an old saying: you can't improve anything without being able to measure it first, and this is really an essential thing. Anecdotally, only earlier this week, we were talking to an automotive supplier in the supply chain about putting basic systems in place to be able to monitor their processes. And sadly, they actually don't have that, and they're not unique. There are many SMEs and even larger companies that aren't taking on board the need to monitor their processes, because they need to monitor their processes initially before they can see what they need to do to improve them. And of course, the net zero thing being an output of that.
I think what both Rogers have reflected there is what we see very much in the market. And I think the other thing we see is the fact that a lot of SME manufacturers aren't really aware of the benefits of going down this path. They only see the negativity of it. So they don't see the fact that they can improve their processes, they can improve their products, they can improve their business performance as well. A lot of them just see it as a challenge and potentially just a cost to them. whereas really they should be looking at it as a big opportunity to improve and also give them competitive advantage.
What we're very keen to do is to talk to SMEs, customers, etc., about their particular circumstances, and then put justification in place for any investment. So any cost that would be consumed by them will be justified by the benefit, by the return on the investment. And that's something that's really, really important.
I even feel it's slightly more pressing around the need for clear business case, at least clear business case methodology, really, even if you can't quite put all the numbers under it. Because, I see with a lot of people that with process improvements, their immediate thoughts, I guess even before the net zero agenda, was that they could, obtain some improvement on their profit margin kind of thing. Whereas net zero going into it, most see it just as cost at the minute. And I think there are some areas where you can get business benefits. Certainly energy is one at the moment. But I think as soon as that one passes, the extra layers of systems that would probably be needed to hit net zero, we're going to have to get a bit clearer about what the business benefits are of that. And it won't just be operational improvements. We'll have to start thinking about company image, winning of tenders, revenue, along those kind of lines, really.
Companies concentrate on cost of investment, as opposed to the longer term, or in many cases a very short term cost, because the return on investment can be in a matter of months or even weeks in some circumstances, as opposed to years. So the payback period can be very, very short once the actual justification has been put in place.
I think really people got to step back from that and understand which bits of Industry 4 actually apply to what they're doing and how their business works and where their challenges are. So applying a total Industry 4 solution in an SME environment, especially if it's on the S side of the SMEs, is really, really difficult and doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. And I think these words and almost jargon have been overused a lot of the time by people who don't really understand necessarily the benefits. They understand the high level, rather than actually looking at what the challenges of that business are and how that business is having to adjust to face those challenges. So I quite often talk about those challenges, in terms of cost, quality and delivery.
Roger Singleton, this whole point about the digitalisation, am I right in thinking that any company, large or small, is not going to be able to embark on its net zero journey if it can't measure what's going on the shop floor right across the board? Because if they can't measure it, as Roger Halliwell was saying earlier, you can't actually action anything. You have to have those digital tools.
Within the buildings and facilities themselves, that there will absolutely need to be information systems and digital connectivity supporting that, because emissions are related to energy usage. And most businesses at the minute, the only way that they can monitor their energy usage is through their utility bill. And most don't have even an understanding of energy split between what is overhead of running the building in terms of heating and electricity and what is going through the process, which would be an incredibly good starting point, for most people on this journey. So I don't actually think at the moment that everyone needs to know their particular CO2 values of each different area down to the individual kilogram, because they're big and wide-ranging across different categories. And actually, they can start looking at the internal change mechanisms that will start to reduce that now. Solutions like what Iain and Roger Halliwell are doing are going to become critical, because if you've got high energy, heated style of process, you're going to have to work really hard, I think, to find the right technology and process control steps to make that, an interesting, viable offering. I think it will become part of the mix. And these factories are big. They're not going to be able to do it by manual checks. We're going to have to be digitally connected. Yeah, for sure.
One of the things that we see an awful lot of day to day throughout facilities is the lack of interconnectivity and the lack of interconnection. So, from ERP systems, from administration systems, down to the shop floor for factory orders, et cetera, and core technology that has been around for years and years and years. For example, something called an MES system, manufacturing execution system. So there's an awful lot of old technology that we can use and still isn't being used that could render, huge assistance in zero, in the zero economy, if you like, so net zero. So there's an awful lot of things that can be done without even mentioning digitalization and Industry 4 and the Internet of Things, etc., etc.
So one of their early challenges is getting data into a format and into a place where they can access it. But what they don't do is monitor it and maintain it then. So if you don't measure it, don't maintain it, it will go backwards. So where we really fit in is providing a mechanism that, first of all, gives you visibility of the operation. It gives you sight of what is actually happening within that and related those back to your key performance indicators.
I mean, one of the aspects I like about, an expert factory is that if I put that back into kind of traditional information theory, which I try and draw on a little bit in some of the work, you start with data that has to go into information, and then if you produce good information, the theory is that you can start embedding knowledge in the people using that information, and so it goes on, up to a results layer. And I was just going to follow up because I think it also feeds in a little bit to what you're saying about some of the program interventions that happen at government level. And actually what a lot of businesses struggle with is either time or talent that can grab data and transform it, or even store it effectively, but transform it into good information at that point. But we don't seem willing to want to fund the time and effort needed to do that. But that's where the change happens. That's the reality of it. That if you've got this continual reporting, at this information layer, then your staff start making different choices over time, and hopefully long-term and repeatable choices. And that's the kind of change that we need to do, not only for net zero, but I think it's sometimes where we've fallen foul with IR4 and other digitalization kind of things. Well, sometimes it's a bit boring and a bit hard work, to be honest. So, yeah.
Something that we get involved with a lot, Nick, is feed studies. And the way we sort of go about our business is initially, look, we say we're not going to prejudge anything. What we want to do is we want to come along and we want to look at your plant and we want to see how your plant's running. So we'll spend quite a bit of time doing that, and we'll also go and talk to the operators and basically all the plant personnel. And then we'll do sort of fact-finding and ask some sort of key questions. And that's how we kind of find out what the sort of key areas are that the company and how companies can improve and reduce energy costs and improve productivity, etc. There's nothing to lose, there's everything to gain.
That's exactly right. And I think what happens when people go on these journeys is they start quite easily, if you like, with the easy changes and see where those are. But there's always incremental changes then to be made through this journey. So the journey continues. It doesn't just stop with the first findings. It moves on as people understand those processes, understand how they can change processes and do that. The way I always advise people to start is to start with something that's a problem and you can see a benefit out of. Because that way you actually get a return on it early on, rather than trying to struggle with something where the return might not be quite so obvious, and it's more difficult to bring people on board as well. So it's really building that up and really getting the game for it. And I think the other thing is, if you do try to take in a whole operation at once, the problem is you won't do it well. You don't have the resource to do it. You don't have the ability to do it. And probably you don't have the finance to do it. So those are all challenges in there. So doing it phased is the right way.
I think there are routes to doing it, but embedding those kind of capabilities that we're talking about environmentally sensitive product design. I mean, crikey, I could even step back 3 or 4 paces. Do they even have a process for product design? Through whole requirements gathering, speccing, testing. I mean, there are methods for it. Product lifecycle analysis is probably the baseline. Some kind of PLM system is probably the management method, for a lot of it. But I think there's a lot of skilling up, really, that needs to be done in terms of that.
In my experience, the most important thing is to start somewhere. Okay, I think once you start looking, you'll start finding all sorts of areas. Obviously, we involve guys like us or Roger or Iain. Then we're going to pick up on things relatively quickly. I'm very, very keen on plant walkarounds. I did one recently, and we found I don't know how many things that could be improved on instantly. I mentioned the ROI process, in terms of we can tell the customer how much they're going to save to justify any investment. Yeah, I understand that as you mentioned before, companies are strapped for cash. Things are tight. Things are difficult economically. But you've got to see that on the longer journey. And you've got to look at that in terms of, well, if somebody can come in and say, well, I can sell you £1 million per annum for £100,000, £200,000 kind of investment, well, you'd be kind of foolish not to do that if you can free the cash. We're actually dealing with a company at the moment, and they're in this exact situation. They want to install process historians to monitor and to measure so that they can improve. And so we're coming up with a scheme for them so that they can actually afford that over a 5-year period. So that's an instance, actually now live that we're dealing with.
I think there's been a lot of people almost trying to put a generic tool out there which gives people a magic solution, and they just look at very simply at the sort of their bills, where those are being spent and what they're doing, and they come to at a high level to it, but they actually don't let them drill down there. And with ESOS and everything else, it's important how you're going to reduce that energy usage, how are you going to reduce that supply chain, how are you going to make all these improvements, and these solutions don't do that. So I think one of the things I would say from that is a lot of these solutions come from collaborations. So it's people being able to help people on bits of the journey, not necessarily all of that journey. And I think the other thing is it's people really understanding and prioritising it so that they get in at the start very, very early and start to make this progress because they can see the benefits to their business.
One of the major issues to overcome is really support from senior management and sponsorship. So there's no question that NetZero is a very good idea, and there are a huge amount of benefits from it. But it really needs to be sponsored from senior management, and then all the way through the company, from boardroom to factory floor. And I think another key thing really is to have objectives, and for companies to have meaningful objectives. And behind objectives are results. So come up with an objective, that's great, but then what do you also want the result to be? And again, we're back to that sort of argument of, you can't improve it unless you measure it. And I think that's fundamental. Otherwise, I think companies will struggle to progress.
First of all, having the right data to solve the right problems key, and not just having lots and lots of data. If it's not structured, it won't help you. So having the right data to solve the right problems is there. Then being able to measure what you're doing and how you're making those improvements and understanding it. And also to the extent that what you're displaying is the real improvements or the real maintained values. So I think data, people, buy-in from top to bottom is absolutely essential.
If you want to talk about starting points, all companies will, the first mandatory reporting that they'll have to do for NetZero will be scope 1 and 2. And this is exactly in the wheelhouse of what these guys are doing around process development.
Rogers, Singleton and Halliwell, thank you so much for an excellent discussion. I thought there was some real gold in there. And thanks to Iain Crosley and, of course, XpertRule Software. Thanks so much to you for watching. On behalf of Manufacturing TV, I'm Nick Peters. Goodbye for now.